There are many shows dedicated to Magic the Gathering strategies, decks, and formats. But unlike all of them, this channel is about discussing an individual card, an isolated card, an unrelated card. This is an Magic card. Hello there, and welcome to episode number one of my cheap bootleg YouTube channel, and Magic Card. As always, I'm your host, Dusty Cupboards, and as always, I'll be exhaustively discussing a randomly selected Magic card. But as always, first, we're going to discuss the comments from the previous installment.
As always.
Commenter Jeremy Oul says that they enjoy when I respond to people's comments. And to be completely honest, this video ended up being so long that I considered not even commenting on the comments. But when you get a comment where somebody says that they like hearing you talk about the comments, it's kind of hard not to talk about that comment. And if I didn't comment on the comments now, after reading this comment, I would kind of feel like a jerk. Patreon supporter and frequent contributor Underflorence points out that I made two different Pokemon-related mistakes in my last video. First of all, I said that Wizards of the Coast developed the Pokemon trading card game, and although they were involved in releasing it in the Western world, they didn't actually have any hand in developing it. I also apparently mispronounced a Pokemon name in that video. What I said was Lugia, but the actual pronunciation is Lugia, as heard here in the Greek version of the 2000 Pokemon movie.
Lugia.
Lugia.
Jose Baveda asked if I have a Twitter account, which at the time I did not. So I went ahead and made one, and so far I've posted absolutely nothing. User Doc said swans, which might not make very much sense to you unless you realize that previously they had said swoons, delayed swoon, swoons v3, swoons again, and also just swoons, which was the original swoon, but not their original comment, which was on my first video, and simply said I'm sold, which given the consistency that they've been watching my videos, seems to be an accurate statement. With those fantastic viewer engagement points out of the way, we can now shift our attention to the primary topic of this video, one of the most dominant cards in the history of the Magic which gathers. Alright, we're back on the page, the thing with the guy, the rat with the truly fantastic flavor text. I'm really glad that I included that in the last video. I feel like it really was super important. And let's see what our next card is. It is it's a very cute looking turtle, I'll tell you that much. I don't think I've seen, no, never mind, I have seen this card before. Yeah, okay, I just didn't recognize the newer art. I guess that means I'm gonna have to talk about two different illustrations. Giant Tortoise is a 2-mana blue common 1/1 turtle creature originally printed in Arabian Nights. We mentioned Arabian Nights ever so briefly in the last video, as its impact on the history of Magic the Gathering is rather expansive. Arabian Nights was in fact the very first expansion ever created, with the 3 sets that preceded it all being core sets, and all consisting of roughly the same set of cards. Arabian Nights was the first time that the base game of Magic, composed of original cards released in alpha, were expanded upon, and not just reprinted with more square corners or different colored borders. The set released on December 17th, 1993, a date which correlates to many significant events, including the first printing of Vogue magazine in 1892, the first controlled flight by the Wright brothers in 1903, the first flight of the Douglas DC-3, which is a pretty neat looking plane, and even neater when you think about the fact that the very field of aviation was only created 32 years prior to its invention. The first episode of The Simpsons also premiered on December 17th in 1989. I tend to find myself almost by reflex, including Simpsons jokes and clips in this show, even though I don't think about The Simpsons regularly and wouldn't list it as one of my favorite shows. To be honest though, when I was a child, it was one of my main obsessions, and although I haven't dwelled much upon it over the past 20 years, since I stopped watching the show after the episode where they killed Maud Flanders, the influence it had on me as a child must have been pretty profound, because it just seems to keep bubbling up to the surface as I make these terrible videos. On December 17th, 2010, 17 years after the release of Arabian Nights, Tarek El Tayeb Mohamed Bouazizi set himself ablaze as an act of protest and frustration at systemic corruption and police abuse in his home country of Tunisia. I spent an inordinate amount of time deciding whether to mention this horrible event in my lighthearted Magic the Gathering video, and I think it's legitimately kind of dangerous to glorify extreme acts of self-harm like this. But like many, I also have a deep reverence for anybody who would make a personal sacrifice on this level to combat injustice, and the notion that somebody could willingly light themselves on fire is simply mind-boggling. And I would be lying if I said that I haven't spent a long time reading the Wikipedia page about self-immolation. To all of my brilliant and passionate viewers, I would like to encourage all of you to stand up for what is right and to defend those who cannot defend themselves. And I would also like to very clearly suggest that you refrain from lighting yourselves on fire. Bouazizi's death marked the beginning of the Arab Spring, which led to sweeping changes throughout the Arab world. And if you couldn't surmise this yourself based on basic nomenclature, this ties us right back to the set Arabian Nights, which released 17 years prior. Out of all Magic sets, Arabian Nights has the distinction of basically being set on a fictionalized version of our own world. As many other companies before them, like Disney's Fairy Tales, Universal's Monsters, and a slew of Sherlocks and Quatermains, from Canon Group Films to Warner Brothers. With Arabian Nights, the fledgling design team at Wizards of the Coast adapted a public domain property to both save money on creative licensing and also bank on a famous story's cultural resonance. 1001 Nights is a series of short stories, which dates back to at least the 10th century, and likely well before that. As a framing device, the story involves a young lady who is set to be executed by a cruel king on the following morning, and so spends the entire night telling him a gripping story with a cliffhanger ending. The next day, he realizes he can't have her killed because he needs to hear the story's resolution. This continues for 1001 Nights, which is where the story collection gets its name. Among these 1001 stories are many well-known tropes and characters like Sinbad, Ali Baba, and Aladdin. Aladdin is also featured in the Disney film Aladdin, which released in 1992, the year prior to the release of Arabian Nights. Also, for the record, I'm going to go ahead and use the pronunciation that most Westerners grew up with, but the name is actually pronounced Aladdin. The 1001 Nights is essentially a deep well of brilliant ideas that lazy Western entertainment brokers have returned to over and over throughout the years to deliver exciting tales of exotic adventures and mystique. The trend of endlessly remaking and rebooting things has definitely gotten pretty bad in modern pop culture, but many of the stories contained within the 1001 Nights have been adapted more times than is worth enumerating. And while Disney and others are still happy to simply keep reworking those same ancient fables, Magic the Gathering has become much more intent on delivering interpretations that are far from simple retellings or even redressings of known characters and narratives. It's because of this that Arabian Nights earns its first demerit, as among the mere 78 cards in the set, we find a pretty predictable list of named characters, tropes, and real-world locations represented. While rebranded as Arabia, the namesake of the Arabia scale, which ranks magic planes based on how likely we are to revisit them, the fact of the matter is that Arabia is mostly just Arabia, and you could therefore potentially buy a Bazaar of Baghdad at an actual bazaar in Baghdad. You could ride a camel through the desert to the pyramids with a copy of Camel, Desert, and Pyramids. These cards are so closely based off of real-world places, people, and events that a couple of them are even banned for being offensive. Even looking at the ones which aren't banned, some of them are kind of offensive. Here with the cards in Arabian Nights, as well as with many other Western adaptations of these classic folktales, we often get the sense that the intent is to be entertained by the alien nature of these things, and not exactly an attempt to understand the culture and traditions where these stories come from. It's Orientalism in its truest sense. Cultural tourism for fun and profit. I'm not going to accuse the amazing Richard Garfield, PhD, or the other two people who designed Arabian Nights of being malicious or intolerant in their intent, but with the great privilege of hindsight and the privilege of living in a time where a greater range of voices can be heard, it's pretty easy to say that a similar set of cards created now would portray the characters, religion, and traditions of the Arabic peoples in a less fetishized way. The production of Arabian Nights was famously short and plagued by numerous logistical issues. To begin with, it's important to understand that Magic was originally supposed to be multiple independent sets of cards, and not one ever-expanding set that could all be played together. In his infinite wisdom, Richard Garfield, PhD, thought that if you have an ever-expanding game, it becomes impossible to test the new cards against all of the older cards. As the complexity increases exponentially, Magic would have been released as isolated sets that could not have been played together. But as is the case with many issues in early Magic design, this was all disrupted by one major factor. The game was way way more popular than anybody had expected it to be. So Arabian Nights was rush ordered to fill a demand for more cards, which was a little bit scary to Richard Garfield, but he decided that it would be fine because they could simply give Arabian Nights cards their own card back to distinguish them from the original set. This would make it kind of a separate thing, and if people didn't like it, they could just ignore it. If you've never seen the original card back that was meant to be used for Arabian Nights, I'm very sorry that you now have to see it because it is atrocious. According to a 2002 article by Richard Garfield, the set Ice Age was also going to have a different card back, which is not something I see referenced very frequently, but it reminds me of the packaging and rules book that accompanied Ice Age cards. I wonder if this frosty cool design was going to be the card back for Ice Age before Magic fans made it clear that they liked uniformity. It certainly does look a lot better than the neon pink Arabian Nights card back because it is atrocious. Ultimately, however, it was decided that the little scimitar on the front of the card would be enough to distinguish the cards from Arabian Nights, and this first set symbol would set the standard for all non-core expansions in the future, including some which confusingly have the same set symbol as the original printing, but we'll get to that in a little bit. The codename for Arabian Nights was Arabian Nights because they hadn't invented codenames yet. Giant Tortoise is card number 15 in that set because there just weren't very many cards in the set. Arabian Nights wasn't a big set or a little set, it was a tiny set. It's even smaller when you realize that one of the 78 cards in Arabian Nights is a basic mountain, which got printed by accident. This mountain is now among the most expensive basic lands you can buy, despite being a common in the set. It's worth noting that Arabian Nights had kind of a weird rarity scheme though. As mentioned previously, our lovely big turtle friend is a common, and it has never been printed at any other rarity in the numerous times it has been reprinted. But rarities in Arabian Nights can be deceptive. At this point in writing the script for this episode, I legitimately stopped to decide whether I wanted to go through the process of explaining the Arabian Nights rarity system. Eventually I decided that the answer was yes, but it was not an easy conclusion to come to, because I know that I'm gonna have to make charts and stuff to help explain this. If you are a big time cardboard conjurer, then you are already aware that Magic cards are printed on sheets of 121 cards. I have one and I would show it to you, but it is inside of a tube, and I've already committed to making charts and stuff, so you'll have to excuse me for being lazy and not wanting to untube it. For a normal set of Magic cards, you will have a common sheet, a rare sheet, and an uncommon sheet. With sets before Legends, however, including Arabian Nights, they only had two sheets, common and uncommon, with 3 times more common sheets being printed. The common and the uncommon sheet would not feature every card the same amount of times though. The aforementioned mountain in Arabian Nights was only printed once on the common sheet, meaning that it was as rare as an uncommon which was printed 3 times on the uncommon sheet. The common sheet featured cards printed once, 4 times, 5 times, and 11 times. The uncommon sheet featured cards printed twice, 3 times, and 4 times. So if you want a relative breakdown of the rarities, it would be listed as uncommon 2, uncommon 3, common 1, uncommon 4, common 4, common 5, and then common 11, from most rare to least rare. To make things even more confusing, Giant Tortoise was printed at both common 1 and common 3, giving it a combined rarity of common 4. But along with 13 other cards in Arabian Nights, one of those printings featured a misprinted mana symbol, which means that for collection purposes, these 2 printings of Giant Tortoise are regarded as separate cards. So even though the image I showed you earlier only had 8 different versions of Giant Tortoise, there are actually 9. Out of all the cards we've examined on this channel, this is by far the most versions we've seen, and with the most variation, including a completely different non-panoramic artwork, which means that the art review section in this video is probably going to be a bit of a doozy. Since we just went through the wildly calculated task of breaking down Arabian Nights rarity sheets, let's stick with the analytical stuff and compare these 9 variations. The first 2 are obviously the C1 and C3 versions from Arabian Nights, as designated by our very elegant little scimitar set symbol. Next in our chronology is the only white-bordered Giant Tortoise, which was printed in 4th edition. Like the core sets before it, Alpha, Beta, Unlimited, and Revised, 4th edition had a slightly different set of reprinted cards. Players were probably very excited to find that Giant Tortoise had been added to 4th edition, along with an array of other exciting cards from both the Dark and Legends. I'm sure they didn't mind that cards like the Dual Lands were removed to make room for these newcomers. Starting with Revised, Wizards of the Coast printed all reprints with white borders to maintain the collectability of the originals. However, this rule was deemed not applicable to languages that had never even seen cards printed to begin with. So as Wizards of the Coast expanded the localization of their game, we see what are called foreign black-bordered cards. This giant tortoise, or Galapago Gigante, or Tartuga Gigante, or Jogame, or Geodaihan Geobug, or Jiangui, are all from 4th edition, even though they have black borders, simply because Spain, Portugal, Japan, Korea, and China had never seen an initial printing of this card before, so for them, this is their alpha equivalent. Next up, we have an obscure printing known as Renaissance, printed in both French and German, and then a separate printing called Renascimento. Renascimento, which contained slightly less cards and was printed in Italian. These are reprint sets though, although like the more well-known set Chronicles, they retain the original set symbol. They also have the copyright information at the bottom though, which helps make it obvious that these are not actually from Arabian Nights. The fact that these cards aren't in English also helps distinguish them, and for some reason, the Italian cards have the word tap in all caps, which looks like absolute garbage. The next two printings of Giant Tortoise aren't actually printings at all, but releases on Magic Online. These online master sets were a way for Wizards of the Coast to put old cards onto their online client. And while I'm not sure how much of a splash these digital cards had on that platform, they finally have their modern creature typing of turtle, and the center justification of the illustrator credit and copyright text looks nice, even though the online master sets have terrible set symbols that look like inoffensive corporate logos from the 90s. The final version of Giant Tortoise is probably the second most important, as it has the updated typing, the 2015 Magic card frame, and snazzy new artwork. Giant Tortoise is therefore a card available with the old frame and the newest frame, despite not having ever been printed with the 2008 modern frame. The typing change for Giant Tortoise happened in 2008 though, with the Grand Creature Type update, but the turtle type had actually existed since Legends, when the card Giant Turtle was printed. Creatures that are associated with water are often blue, but confusingly, tortoise are a subset of turtles that live exclusively on land. So if anything, you would expect Giant Turtle to be a blue card, and Giant Tortoise to maybe be a green card. Either way though, if you're looking to reduce creature type redundancy, making a tortoise into a turtle is both a solid choice and scientifically accurate. Giant Tortoise had previously been the only tortoise card, and it is still the only tortoise in Magic, excluding the card Tortoise Formation from Shards of Alara. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Giant Tortoise is not and has never been a giant though, and is therefore one of 22 giant creatures that are not giants, including Giant Killer, which I had previously presumed to be an individual who kills giants, but which I'm now realizing might just be a murderer of incredible size. Exactly how giant is Giant Tortoise though? You'll notice that in neither of the card illustrations is there a clear indication of scale. Magic cards will often have scale birds, shown to indicate the size of a behemoth, or perhaps even a small figure in the foreground. Giant Tortoise has neither of these visual devices though, and on top of that, it's also a 1/1 creature. As you would know if you are super smart, or if you watched my last episode, in the game of Magic the Gathering, even a tiny rat is a 1/1. Some rats are even bigger than that, and none of those rats are described as being giant. Giant tortoises aren't actually some kind of enormous, magically enlarged terrestrial turtle though. Unlike giant spider, or giant caterpillar, or giant slug, which are all clearly of abnormal size, giant tortoise is actually the real-world designation for a series of tortoise species, including Chelonoidis becki, Chelonoidis cathamensis, Chelonoidis darwini, Chelonoidis donfaustoi, Chelonoidis duncanensis, Chelonoidis gwentheri, Chelonoidis hudensis, Chelonoidis microphyes, Chelonoidis fantasticus, Chelonoidis portorum, Chelonoidis vandenbergi, and Chelonoidis vicina, as well as the extinct species of Chelonoidis nigra and Chelonoidis abingdoni, which saw its last living member, Lonesome George, pass away in 2012, in what can only be described as one of the most hyper-depressing moments in the recent ecological history of our planet. If you need to go ahead and stop watching the video here for a minute and be sad about Lonesome George, feel free to do so.
Slam that pause button.
None of these species of giant tortoise are especially large though, at least not in comparison to Tommy Turtle, the world's largest turtle, who rides upon the world's largest snowmobile in Bottineau, North Dakota, where at over 3 tons, he lords over the nearby tennis courts with a terrifying expression of ceaseless jubilation. Even compared to the tortoise-heavy assault tank deployed by the British during the Second World War, which is smaller than the diabolical Tommy, despite weighing 78 tons, the largest living giant tortoise looks pretty diminutive. This all contributes and possibly finally affirms in unquestionable terms Einstein's thesis that all things are relative. relative. Compared to the golden tortoise beetle, a member of the Charodotella genus, along with 99 other tortoise beetles, which I actually contemplated listing here, a giant tortoise is truly enormous. Although compared to Kaja, the Lakota turtle constellation, even Tommy the turtle is unimaginably small. Real-world strength and durability don't often translate well to Magic cards, as the power and toughness system isn't quite granular enough to capture the noticeable gaps in capability between things like gnats, humans, and molten hydras. If we wanted to assign some numbers to these various turtles we've examined though, I would have to give Tommy the turtle something along the lines of 0 power and 8 toughness, because despite being quite menacing, I'm not sure how much damage Tommy could inflict. The British A39 Tortoise Heavy Assault Tank would be something like a 6/6, although it might be a vehicle rather than a creature, since as far as I know, tanks themselves are not sentient. The giant snowmobile that Tommy the turtle rides on would also maybe be a vehicle. Tommy himself isn't actually alive either, so he would probably be a wall, although walls aren't really alive either, which makes one wonder why those are considered creatures in Magic the Gathering. Regardless, in this basic power toughness model, a giant tortoise of one of the 12 living or 2 extinct species we listed earlier could logically be a 1/1 creature. Unlike cards like Thunderous Snapper and Steelbane Hydra, who both have multiple heads, or Scuttlegator, which for some unfathomable reason has a crocodile face and crab legs, the turtle on Giant Tortoise isn't some kind of fantasy turtle. Giant Tortoise falls into a subcategory of turtle cards, which I would describe as being just regular turtles. The second category of turtles would be just regular, very big turtles, which includes Coldwater Snapper, which has very prominent scale birds, Misford River Turtle, which has a red-capped goblin riding on its back, and Silberland Snapper, which appears to be very startled by the horseback rider who approaches it by lantern light. The third and final category of magic turtles is wildly fantastical turtles, including the crocodile crab nonsense I mentioned already, as well as Arkelos, who is a turtle folk, Yidaro, who is a Godzilla monster turtle, and Wandering Tombshell, which is a gigantic zombie turtle with an entire mausoleum on its back. Wandering Tombshell is also a callback to Meandering Tower Shell, a card I cannot resist mentioning, because in addition to also being equally gigantic, it is also so slow that it actually takes 2 turns for it to attack. Attacking isn't really what these beaky armored creatures are all about though, as their shells impart them with exceptional defense, in a rather smart representation of their real-world counterparts. For many of these turtles, the toughness is baked in. We're seeing a lot of big butts on these clump-footed reptiles. When a creature in Magic the Gathering has the same power and toughness, that's sometimes called having square stats, but a lot of these turtles have very skewed stats. Parallelogram stats, if you will. 0-3, 0-5, 1-4, 2-4, 1-6, 5-7, 5-9. Giant Tortoise is a 1/1 though, true to its previously established approximate Tommy Tank relation, but the superb defensive capabilities of its curved carapace alter these stats when it is untapped. If the Giant Tortoise both literally and figuratively sticks its neck out and goes on the attack, it suddenly becomes vulnerable, but when it's sitting in a cautious state, its singular line of rule text grants it an additional +0/+3. If you just want a blocker, then Giant Tortoise is a 1/4 for 2 mana, which compares pretty favorably against something like Horned Turtle. Riptide Defender will give you 5 toughness on a flashy defender for the same cost, but having a little bit of power can actually be relevant for a blocker, as otherwise you open yourself up to being quickly worn down by a bunch of 3/1s. Being able to chip in for 1 damage is also not irrelevant. There are only 10 1/4s for 2 mana in the history of Magic the Gathering, and 4 of them require a more difficult mana investment. It's a stat block that really gums up the ground, and this is where turtles of all types can shine. Games of Magic the Gathering are generally broken down into 3 different intervals: the early game, the mid game, and the late game. These different time periods correlate to the 3 primary deck archetypes, which produce a very loose kind of rock, paper, scissors metagame. You have aggro, which seeks to end the game as quickly as possible with short-sighted aggression. Control, which seeks to delay the game as long as possible so that its incremental advantages can overwhelm the opponent with value. And midrange, which seeks to stomp out aggro strategies while also playing hard to remove threats that can power through control strategies. In a healthy format, these strategies should each be relevant, and the viability of both control and aggro should prevent the other from running rampant, while also creating room for midrange in the blind spot created by their polarizing game plans. My favorite format, Commander, also known as EDH, has a metagame which is drastically skewed towards combo decks because aggro is hardly even a thing, and the diversity of threats means that running a traditional control deck is basically impossible. Does this mean that EDH is a bad format? Yes, it does mean that. and I love it. Big butt turtles are much better in formats where aggro exists though, because when you see a 2 mana value creature with 4 toughness, that bad boy is essentially a one-way ticket to the mid game. You slap any kind of turtle on the board on turn 2, and you're pretty much guaranteed to survive the initial onslaught. If your opponents use a burn spell to kill your blocker, that's one less burn spell that they can point at your face. Whenever you're thinking about running a defensive creature like this in draft, it's important to take stock of how the stats line up against likely attackers in that format. Arabian Nights came out in a time before drafting was really a thing, although our big Shelly friend did show up in one victorious draft deck at the 1996 Los Angeles Pro Tour as part of a hard control deck. In Eternal Masters, when Giant Tortoise triumphantly returned, it had more of a chance to shine though, and Hall of Famer Paulo Vitor Damo de Rosa, also known as PVDDR, the highest earning Magic Pro of all time, and verified super nice person, hailing from the most southern of Americas, stated in his 2016 draft guide for Eternal Masters that Giant Tortoise reigns supreme as the best blocker in the set. High praise for a cold-blooded paperweight. He goes on to more specifically talk about trying to always pick up a couple tortoises for his blue decks, and notes just how good defensive creatures like this can be out of sideboards. If I can find some good footage of somebody drafting Eternal Masters and making a fantastic block with this relatively giant tortoise, I'll include that footage at this point in the video, and maybe dramatically zoom in on the tortoise to emphasize just how impressive its blocking prowess is. I also located the episode of Mark Rosewater's podcast where he discusses Arabian Nights to see if I could find any interesting tidbits about Giant Tortoise, but the length of his examination is not quite up to par with my more long-winded review.
Okay, Giant Tortoise. Giant Tortoise costs 1 in the blue. It is a 1/1 creature, but when untapped, it gets +0/+3. So essentially it's a 1/4 when untapped and a 1/1. So it's a very good defensive creature, but not so good an attacking creature. Not much else to say about the Giant Tortoise, other than it is a tortoise. At some point, we try to figure out the difference between turtles and tortoises and stuff. I think nowadays we just use turtle. In fact, this card probably is eroded to a turtle, is my guess. Okay, next, Guardian Beast.
I also found Marshall Sutcliffe's initial impressions of the Eternal Masters Limited format, and he didn't even mention Giant Tortoise once, but that's probably because he was distracted by the presence of Mana War. Having given my second favorite format a good amount of attention, we can now veer back towards my favorite format, Commander, also known as EDH, which as I already established is very fun and horribly unbalanced. I already mentioned by name the only 2 real legendary turtles that exist, but Arkelos is the new kid on the block, and he's got a bunch of colors up in the top right corner of his card. So that means people are more inclined to build decks around him. It wouldn't appear that Turtle Tribal is going anywhere fast though, as there are only 5 Arkelos decks on the statistics tracking website EDHREC, which fall into that category. Silver lining here though, of those 5 decks, 100% of them feature Giant Tortoise. 100% is the highest percentage that you can have. 31 other unrelated decks also feature Giant Tortoise on EDHREC, but Lord knows why. Doran the Siege Tower is the classic Toughness Matters commander, and he cannot include blue cards. Arcades can run blue cards, but he specifically wants defenders, like the flashy Riptide Turtle we saw earlier. Phoenix is a blue commander that likes toughness also, but using the confusing advanced filters function on EDHREC, we can see that Giant Tortoise is actually only included in one of his 314 decks. One place you might want to include Giant Tortoise is in a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles theme deck, and I've actually seen some of these over the years, since Mutant and Ninja are both creature types in addition to Turtle. Since Giant Tortoise came out in 1993 though, it's actually not a teenager. This slow-moving land turtle is 28 years old. Go ahead and blast a comment in the comment section. If you're younger than the stupid magic card I'm talking about, you could interpret the common usage of teenager to simply be a colloquial, homocentric term to describe adolescence, which might allow some turtles to expand their teenage years, since many species of tortoise can live well above 150. Although according to the internet, tortoises reach full maturity at 20 years old, which would actually make their definition of adolescence and teenage completely identical. In case you have a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles theme deck, and you are suddenly distraught over the realization that some turtle cards are too old to be considered teenagers, realize now that the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles themselves are 37 years old, although within their endless reinventions, they are supposedly always 15, which raises lots of questions. How are 15-year-olds driving a party wagon? You need to be at least 16 to get a driver's license in New York City, and you probably need a special permit to be able to drive a vehicle that shoots pizzas. The card Giant Tortoise doesn't hail from the Big Apple though. Looking at the 2 separate Giant Tortoise artworks, we see no dank sewers or hazy cityscapes, just wide open blue skies. The contrast between these two pieces is pretty stark though, with the Eternal Masters piece fitting in much better with the modern Magic sensibility, while the original is very flat and would not likely see print today outside of a more stylized promo product. Kaja Folio, the artist of the Arabian Nights version, has a name which many seasoned Magic fans will be familiar with, because while she only illustrated 63 cards from 1993 to 1998 and one random card in Darksteel, she is responsible for some very memorable paintings on some famous cards, and also worked alongside her husband, Phil Folio, who is credited for 59 Magic cards, including some where he is listed as Claymore J. Flapdoodle, and some where he collaborated with his wife Kaja. It's also worth noting that Kaja is depicted on the card Autumn Willow, painted by Margaret Organ Keene, who we've talked about before. Overall, the folios are well known for having a distinctly cartoony style, and both of them, although especially Phil, are big on bulbous shapes and gemstone highlights. Kaja's works tend to be more elegant and with less extreme contrast. While her works are certainly more comical and pictorial than current Magic card art, I think the sillier aspects of her reputation are incorrectly compounded by her husband's more frequently outlandish depictions. They share a lot of technical execution, but among Kaja's works are some really subtle and poetic images, where her graphic style comes across as dignified and decorative rather than silly. The artwork for Wind Spirit is soft and understated, while Hydroblast carries a certain serene mystique. The Sol Thrall contains a human butt, although the contorted composition and simple color shifts and texture make this piece feel like something from a modern art gallery rather than a trading card game. The art for the card Spirit Link was used to promote the set Legends, and I distinctly remember seeing it on a display by the cash register at my local game store. I purchased my own very first packs of Magic cards specifically to try and acquire this very cool flying cat, largely because the Art Deco framing and gracefully rendered bat wings really appealed to me. I was disappointed that this art was not featured on a flying cat card, but instead on an enchant creature card, but it will always stick with me as one of my early impressions from the game. Giant Tortoise is one of Kaja's first contributions to Magic, and it's even more simplistic than many of her other works, with flat planes of murky green delineating overly defined wrinkles and plates. The background is seemingly accomplished with a few wispy paint daubs, and overall the piece kind of feels childish or abstract, like a stained glass window or an etching. I wouldn't really describe this painting as being very aesthetically pleasing, and the background color is really underwhelming next to the blue card frame, but I also can't argue that this image is instantly recognizable and weirdly iconic. The extreme angle of the turtle's neck, the odd perspective, and the repetitive lines and shapes turn this painting into more of a symbol of a turtle than a representation of a turtle. This art would make a great stamp and could work just as well in two-tone black and white. The Eternal Masters version of Giant Tortoise owes its more lifelike artwork to Richard Wright, whose name might be less instantly familiar to my viewers, although he has illustrated 84 cards from Ravnica all the way up till today. His style is much more about the feeling of a place, and his works often contain awe-inspiring and atmospheric elements. Naturally, he has illustrated many lands, and in some ways his Giant Tortoise treats the terraced pools and misting spray with as much relish as the plodding creature, which is its central figure. Looking over the totality of Richard's work is an exuberant and tranquil experience, and he is truly gifted at making us feel transported to a distant landscape where we are just tiny observers to breathtaking sights. Richard appears to work mostly digitally, and many of his paintings feature textural elements which show signatures of this flexible and forgiving medium. There are certainly a number of paintings in his portfolio which lack clear indications of methodology though, and I'm an ardent advocate for embracing any technique that yields effective results. My favorite of his works might be Hazaret's Monument, which features the understated lowlights of distant megaliths against a hazy smoldering sky, which, as I've mentioned before, is the sort of stuff I'm a big sucker for. Some of his most quintessential works might be Merciless Eviction, Mana Confluence, Guild, Gold, which is a token made by Guild, Pearl Lake Ancient, or this Kraken, which I'm pretty sure I once saw reused on some sort of computer packaging. Hopefully I can find a picture of that, because I don't actually remember what it was. Richard's rendition of Giant Tortoise is as tangible and serene as any of his vistas, and the turtle seems to be really enjoying the cool mists that surround it. The obscuring effect of the airborne water particles allows much of the turtle's hindquarters and the background elements to fade into a dreamlike haze, which Richard employs so often in his paintings, to lend an ethereal feeling and allow our eyes to focus on more pertinent elements. The reflection in the pools is a real high point here. It's convenient for presentation purposes that this turtle is almost a mirror image of its predecessor, and the diagonal lines created by the crags banks make the environment feel like an untamed convergence of flowing water and unyielding rock. The bright directional lighting allows the pink mouth and yellow stripes to really pop amidst the steely blue surroundings. The creature's coloration and backswept horns lend this reptile a less grounded appearance, and while not completely fantastical, it's clearly no tortoise that resides on our world. Masters sets don't take place on a specific plane, but the Eternal Masters version of Giant Tortoise has a clear indicator of its locality, and it's in the flavor text, which was generously gifted for this reprinting.
In the coastal states of Jess and Valeron, tortoise is synonymous for stubborn.
I don't know where these places are off the top of my head, but they might sound familiar because they are also referenced on Tortoise Formation, which we mentioned earlier. Whoever at Wizards of the Coast is responsible for creating this narrative connection is doing a fantastic job. Tortoise Formation is from Shards of Alara, which takes place on a plane we don't have time to talk about, which is called Alara. Jess is an island nation within the Shard of Bant, which is part of the larger plane of Alara, which is broken into shards. The island of Jess, and I'm not going to look up the pronunciation for that because I just don't have time, is under constant siege from the mainland nation of Valeron. And in this way, the island shares many of the qualities of a turtle in its defensive stature and proximity to water. The Eternal Master's tortoise is also shown in proximity to water, which is a bit confusing considering that being land-based is a defining feature that sets tortoises apart from other turtles. But tortoises have no aversion to water, and I really enjoy how well the flavor text has tied this ongoing conflict on Bant with our intrepid, shell-bound subject matter. I actually had a turtle myself for a while. My former boss found it in a busy intersection and tasked me with taking care of it. With the cold months of winter rolling in, I decided to keep it indoors until spring, and despite its general lack of movement or interaction, I grew quite fond of its pensive facial expressions and was wildly entertained by its habit of blowing bubbles out of its nose. Eventually the weather warmed up and I returned this turtle to a nearby wetland, and despite the fact that the turtle seemed completely ambivalent to its newfound freedom and the loss of my companionship, for me it was not a completely painless farewell. I'm not sure if the island nation of Jess has a mascot or a sigil, but if it doesn't, I would suggest the tortoise shell as a nice motif. The Arabian Nights tortoise is obviously on Arabia, but in a set with so many specific literary allusions, we might want to ask why they made room for an innocuous creature like an ordinary, regular-sized giant tortoise, alongside flying carpets and other more mystical icons. At first, I thought the inclusion of giant tortoise was meant to evoke the classic notion that the world is a disc supported on the back of 4 elephants that ride on top of a turtle, which I believe is mentioned at least a few times in 1001 Nights, in addition to being featured in Terry Pratchett's delightfully absurd Discworld novels. But since that turtle holds up the entire world, it wouldn't likely be a 1/1 creature. A more likely source of inspiration is the fairy tale The Prince and the Tortoise, which was seemingly contained in some versions of the 1001 Nights. I read this story, and it was longer than it needed to be, but I will summarize it here for you very succinctly. A sultan wants his 3 sons to marry, and his advisors tell him to have them blindly shoot arrows from the terrace that overlooks a village. This is an insane idea, but the first 2 sons, blindfolded and ready to mingle, shoot arrows that land on houses of a noble and a general respectively. The youngest son's arrow, however, lands on a mystery house, and when they go to visit this mystery house, they find that its sole occupant is a tortoise. The sultan thinks this must be a mistake, and has his young son repeat the arrow shooty blindfold thing, only to hit the tortoise's house 2 more times. Why a tortoise owns a house is never explained, but the youngest son is pious and chooses to marry the tortoise as it appears to be the will of God. This is the setup for the remaining story, which is mostly about tricking innocent people into putting poop into their food and pouring soup on top of their heads, which sounds ridiculous, but is in no way a misrepresentation of the story's events. But I think the setup is really the best part of the story, and while I don't know if I'd marry a tortoise, I'd certainly never be unhappy to meet one. So hey, let's go meet one. Hey buddy. Hi there. I have to say that I was initially disappointed when I got the card Giant Tortoise as our random card for this episode, because of the rudimentary artwork of the original card, the inevitable frequency with which we will end up discussing common creatures, and the straightforward mechanics of the card, making the prospect of discussing it seem more arduous than exciting. I have to say though that the card, the artwork, and the many goofy looking species of tortoises have really grown on me through this process. My YouTube suggestions are now overrun with tortoise videos due to my Google monitored tortoise research, and watching these videos does make me wonder what my life would be like with a rough-skinned boulder as a pet. And considering how long tortoises live, if I did decide to go down that route, my turtle friend would most likely outlive me, which is a strange but welcome inversion of the heartbreaking reality that most pet ownership requires. So while I scoffed jocularly at the story of the prince and the tortoise, taking care of one of these gentle giants really is a lifelong commitment, and I guess that isn't really that different from what a marriage is all about. And while the notion of firing arrows off of a balcony raises a lot of very real public safety concerns, it's not really any more unpredictable than pressing the random card button on Gatherer. So maybe the advisors were not that misguided, and the tale is not just a wacky bedtime story to entertain a wrathful king, but a reminder that sometimes you need to discard your preconceptions and embrace your destiny and allow yourself to fall in love with a tortoise. Alright everybody, that is the end of episode number 11. I hope you enjoyed it. I wanted to have this video done a little bit sooner, but my IRL life has been a little bit hectic. In addition to this nonsense, I also produced 2 other videos in the past 2 weeks for my job, so it's been a real test of endurance. I recently got an assistant for my work, which is great, but I've also been training her, which ironically takes a lot of work. I also serve on a committee, and it looks like I'm also going to be joining a board, so with all of that said, I just want to reassure all of you that I'm still making these stupid videos. I hope all of your IRL lives are going good, and that you're doing well. Please let me know in the comments if you have any personal turtle experiences. Also let me know in the comments what card you think I should review next. It will have absolutely no bearing on what is chosen, but I'd still be curious to know. Go ahead and find me on Twitter or Patreon if you want to. Subscribe to my channel if you want to. Like the video if you want to. Send this video to 10 of your friends before midnight, otherwise you'll die if you want to. And I'll see you next time on And Magic.